Canary by Cloud9 and 3/4. Chapter 40. Confidence. Midoriya took a few steps back, stumbling over his own feet in the surprise of it. Meanwhile, Siren took off from his shoulder, hovering protectively in between the two of them.
"Aww, it's your birdie," she cried. "I love birdies."
He narrowed his eyes.
"Himiko!" Toga shrieked. "I knew you loved me, really. Come on, Canary, let's go."
Midoriya let a growl from his throat. He couldn't physically say the word Toga, but Himiko was a little easier. She bounded a little closer.
"Oh, I've missed you. I don't like the mask, though."
An odd sternness came over her. Suddenly she was pointing a knife at him. Midoriya didn't know where it had even come from.
"Get rid of it. It hides the prettiest part of your face."
Siren took that moment to attack. She let out some kind of battle cry as she rocketed forwards. Toga made a noise of disgust, trying to batter away with her blade.
"Hey!"
she exclaimed in clear annoyance, waving her arms about. While she was distracted, Midoriya prepared to turn tail and run. He had to get back to where there were at least security cameras. As he ran around the large circular corridor, he glanced over his shoulder to see if the villain was following him. But she wasn't. But he knew Toga. He knew how she worked. So he skidded to a halt and swung his fist blindly. If she wasn't behind him, she had to already be in front. But Midoriya's face didn't connect with Toga's face. Midoriya's fist didn't connect with Toga's face, missing her by inches as she dived forwards, her shining blade cutting through his hair, but not his skin, leaving feathers in her wake. Where was Siren? But Midoriya didn't have time to answer that question. He skidded to the side, avoiding another lunge. However, he'd had just enough of dodging and evading. The haunting words of Shishiguro filled his mind. "Why aren't you fighting back?" A fortitude filled him, and finally he did. He was marching forwards with determined swings of his fists, trying to reach Toga, who artfully evaded his attacks as she made her own. They were in a complete stalemate, neither quite reaching the other.
"Oh, it's like we're dancing,"
Toga leered. A dance with death, perhaps. And Midoriya hadn't been dancing for a long time now. And now Siren was back. Midoriya had been worried for a second there, but she was flying all wrong and wonky. Despite that, she quite literally threw herself at Midoriya's attacker. Her little talons drew a speck of blood on Toga's cheek. With another infuriated growl, the villain's attention was diverted towards the bird for the millisecond that Midoriya needed. He'd been watching his friends spar yesterday during their hero training. Kirishima felt bad for him when he saw him all alone, and had called him over. With a short break from super moves, he was fighting Uraraka, who had become rather proficient at various forms of martial arts. By no means a master, but she knew how to get things done. There was a move she'd used that rendered even the unstoppable force of Kirishima motionless, a sort of twist of the wrist, using her opponent's body against them. Midoriya was a quick learner, but it would have worked better if Uraraka hadn't used it on Toga before. Because instead of her, it was now Midoriya who was face down on the floor, his arms pinned behind his back, whilst his opponent giggled maniacally. He struggled against her hold, but thankfully Siren was still around. She turned in the air and whizzed back towards Toga like a feathered bullet. But with snake-like reflexes, the villain managed to grasp her from the air. Both canaries were in her claws. She squeezed Siren like a stress ball.
"Come on, Canary," she sighed. "You're just being difficult now. Let's go already."
That was when Siren bit her harshly on her finger. She yelped in pain and surprise, flinging her across the hallway. She crashed into the wall, falling to the ground with a squeak and a soft thud. "Siren!" Midoriya cried. The word may have come out of his mouth strangely, lacking the S and muffling the N, but the anguish was clear. But neither he nor Toga could make another move before the walls separating them from the oblivious examination shattered with a chorus of cries and a dramatic boom. Toga leapt out of the way to save herself from the rubble. Immediately, Midoriya skidded across the floor over to his fallen canary, grasping her form as a sizable piece of wall tumbled to where she had been lying. No one on the outside had noticed that there had been people in that blast radius who weren't involved in the exam yet. So, ignoring the pain of soon-to-be bruises and the sizable cut on his forehead, Midoriya scrambled to his feet, lowering Siren into his jacket pocket to keep her safe. He charged out into the main arena through the hole in the wall. There were heroes there, licensed or not. What Midoriya hoped was for Toga to be unconscious. What he expected was for her to realize it was a lost cause and scamper out of sight. However, he did not factor in that this girl was freaking crazy! Bounding out from the rubble and avoiding what seemed to be a burst water pipe, the villain continued her pursuit of Midoriya, tossing a blade in Midoriya's direction with startling accuracy. It cut at his cheek, his whole one, ripping the fabric of Shoji's mask and drawing the slightest bit of blood, mirroring Toga's scratch marks. But when Midoriya saw the girl reappear, it was not Toga's face, but Cammy's that appeared. Midoriya didn't know how her quirk worked. With the villain's fascination with blood, it wasn't hard to conclude that the two had a correlation. In which case, what had happened to the real Cammy? Now wasn't the time, however, to be worrying about such things, because Toga, stubbornly masquerading as Cammy, was being as ferocious as ever. From her white boots, she pulled an array of shining knives and with a grin, lunged at Midoriya with the one in her right hand, keeping the other secure in her left. Midoriya picked up his graceful routine of dodging and evading initially. However, being out in the open didn't make his confidence waver one bit, and it wasn't long before he began to fight back, being cautious that the blades didn't come any closer to his skin than they already had. It was a tough game to play, especially when there was someone else Midoriya had to keep an eye on too. The exam. No one really noticed at first. They were so busy focusing on their own tasks that they overlooked the sight of two supposed heroes fighting. There was a lot of fighting going on. But there shouldn't have been between examinees. Even worse, these weren't examinees. At least they were supposed to be. "Hey, what's going on?" called a member of Gang Orca's pod, aiming his cement gun at Toga's and Midoriya's direction in confusion. Midoriya took the moment to distance himself slightly, prepared to try and explain what was going on, but in the adrenaline rush he completely forgot one vital fact. He couldn't! With a sly grin, Toga tossed another blade at Midoriya. She was fast, but Midoriya was too. Once again, it simply scraped at the fabric of his mask, tearing it further. On the ground, kicked in this direction, likely by Midoriya himself during the rush of it all, was a broken pipe. Once possibly belonging to where the water was spurting out of the wall. It was a poor design, really. In a split-second decision, Midoriya stamped his foot down on that pipe so it flung up into his hands, just in time. If his mental calculations were correct, Toga would throw the next knife and miss by millimeters, once more scraping at his good cheek. If she did that, it could hit the sidekick who stood behind them. So with the pipe in hand, he managed to knock the blade out of harm's way, sending it clattering to the floor. He was secretly rather proud of that move. Toga simply smiled, the final knife poised and ready. Midoriya narrowed his eyes. She wanted a fight? And oh, she would get one! Aizawa stood up in his seat. Was that Midoriya? His eyes widened. We need to stop the exam. What? Miss Joke scoffed, raising an eyebrow. Why? What's going down there? It's Midoriya. Midoriya! And now Emmy's eyes widened too. What's he? Midoriya, being a problem child as always, had disappeared to go to the toilet far too long ago now. Aizawa had hoped that he'd just gotten lost. What he hadn't expected was for him to turn up in the arena, fighting ruthlessly with a knife-wielding Shiketsu student, whilst all who had noticed watched on in bewilderment. The idiots! Canary smart, Aizawa explained as he leapt over the rows of seats in front of him. He's in there for a reason. And that girl seems to be it. Miss Joke followed him nimbly. A villain in the provisional hero licensing exam. Seems like it. Aizawa agreed. He started to unravel his scarf. Go to the officials in the control booth. Tell them what's going on. I'll handle this. Emmy hesitated, but nodded, turned on her heel, and started to jog around the incredibly wide arena to reach the man in charge. Aizawa tied the end of his scarf to the banister that separated the seating area from the arena itself. Making sure it was no longer caught around his neck, he used it to abseil down the length of the wall. Yes, it meant he'd sacrifice his capture weapon, but it also meant he could get down there to his student at a far quicker rate than taking the stairs and the convoluted maze of corridors this stadium held. He reached the ground, almost tripping over the rubble littered there as he turned to get his bearings. Midoriya hadn't been far. He had been right over there. But then there was a loud alarm filling his ears. Groaned the monotone voice of the head of the event. The present every last HUC member has been saved from impending danger. Therefore, I declare that this test is finally over. Aizawa stared for a moment before getting a hold of himself and hurrying over, ignoring the further instructions that were spilt. With the distance Emmy had been from the booth, it could take a little longer before the situation was properly explained to the officials. That Shiketsu girl. He didn't know where she had gone, but Midoriya didn't seem to be preoccupied with her now. Instead, it seemed that he had jumped right into the examination to pull one of Emmy's kids out of harm's way as Todoroki and Inasa failed to respond accurately to how Todoroki's fire would affect the movement of Inasa's wind. The other hero students around him looked over in utter confusion. Most of them had been fighting Gang Orca's sidekicks whilst all of this was happening, completely unaware of Midoriya's actions. Aizawa sighed internally. This kid would be the end of him, that was for sure. Midoriya, where did she go? Aizawa insisted as soon as they made eye contact. He just handed that kid, Shindo, his name might have been, over to one of his classmates. Now he was busy clutching at his mask, which was rather tattered and scorched, and holding it in place. He looked relatively unharmed. With his free hand, Midoriya pointed toward a gaping hole in the wall. It was probably where they had come from in the first place. Aizawa frowned. Perhaps that fire tornado had been sent not only in Shindo's direction, but Midoriya's and the villain's too. It must have dispersed the two, and Midoriya decided to prioritize the safety of Shindo rather than the capture of the villain, who must have taken the moment to escape. He looked back to Midoriya. Stay with the hero students, he ordered, turned on his heel, and charged after the girl. He ran through corridor after corridor down every path that she could have possibly taken in such a short space of time. What baffled Aizawa was how much seemed to have happened whilst he was just abseiling down the wall. Eventually, he reached the exit. There were security guards there who quickly informed him that to their knowledge, no one had been in or out since the exam began. They had radios and had already been told that there may be an intruder in their midst, but she could not be located. Aizawa marched back to the arena, balling his fists in frustration as he did so. Not only had the villain gotten away, but Midoriya had dealt with it all by himself with no backup, no support, and no one there to save him. Again! Ooh, Midoriya was in so much trouble. I cannot let you out of my sight for 1 second. Mr. Aizawa seethed, his eyes twitching in irritation. Could Midoriya just use this moment to mention how weird he looked without his scarf on? The moment I do, you go and do something like this. They were alone in some kind of office. The large glass windows overlooked the arena down below, where the hero students had now gathered to collect the results to their provisional licensing exam. When Midoriya's friends saw him in the crowd, they had been about as confused as everyone else seemed to be. Shinso tried asking what was going on, but Midoriya insisted he'd explain later. He wasn't sure what he'd be allowed to say, considering how well the stain incident went down. The first time, you go off and defeat the hero killer Stain, continued his teacher. Then, at the summer camp, not only did you take down Muscular, but you also got yourself kidnapped. Then, you turn up 2 weeks later at UA with a little girl by your side who has seemingly rarely seen the light of day before she met you. Now, you try and go to the toilet and end up in yet another fight for your life. Midoriya fiddled nervously with his mask. He'd pretty much ruined it now. Well, he managed to stretch it enough to tie the ripped part up in a knot, but it was so scorched that it was threatening to completely fall apart at any moment. Here, Mr. Aizawa sighed. Midoriya blinked down at his hands. There was a marker pen there and, an unused flipboard just across the room. Explain, he insisted. Nervously, Midoriya hurried over to the paper, and after another uncertain glimpse back at the furious face of his teacher, he started to write. I bumped into a girl called Cammy. Her teacher was looking for her earlier, but I think she just went down to the toilets. She said she was a fan and asked for an autograph and that she had a pen and paper in her bag, which we went to get. I didn't know my way around, so she led the way. However, she did not take me to where her bag was, and instead the corridor behind that hole in the wall. We fought. I climbed out so there would be more heroes around, but then... I'm going to stop you there. Mr. Aizawa suddenly interrupted. Midoriya jumped back from the paper immediately, almost bumping right into Mr. Aizawa as he did so. He'd written in rather small handwriting, respectively, filling up most of the page with what he had said already. Why did you fight? Pressed Mr. Aizawa. Ah, yes, that was probably a good thing to specify. Midoriya quickly pulled off the used piece of paper, turned it over, and wrote a hurried explanation. That was not the real Cammy. It was Himiko Toga from the League of Villains. Mr. Aizawa stared at what he'd written for a moment. Eventually, he sighed deeply and put his head in his hands. Is it a quirk? She could transform into people. Midoriya uncapped the pen again. I don't know. That was why I didn't think it could be her at first. But she partially transformed back when I ran out into the arena. Then where's the real Cammy? Midoriya was disappointed that he could do nothing but shrug. And... Toga? I'm guessing you know her? Midoriya gulped, hesitated before writing an answer. She was one of the villains who kept me captive. Of course. Mr. Aizawa groaned. He looked like he was having a migraine. There was a knock on the door. Through it shortly came a rather exhausted-looking man with hair at a length midway between Midoriya's own and that of Mr. Aizawa. His gaze drifted lazily between the two of them for a moment before resting on the latter. Is the matter resolved? He asked, and Midoriya recognized his voice as the man who was making the announcements earlier. No, Mr. Aizawa replied in a tone that suggested that it should have been obvious. The man sighed. He turned to Midoriya. Izuku, Midoriya, he began. My name is Yokumiru Mera. I am a representative of the Hero Public Safety Commotion. Our records say that you should have been taking part in the examination today. Yes, except we sent a letter in explaining that Midoriya was unable to take part because of his injury. Mr. Aizawa snapped. However, as you can see, he was perfectly capable of dealing with this entire situation on his own, due to a lack of proper security that allowed an A-rank villain into your facility. They have been identified, then? The man groaned. He couldn't sound less interested. Himiko Toga, a psychopathic murderer and a member of the League of Villains. Was Mr. Aizawa actually angry at them rather than Midoriya? This is one of the villains who kept Midoriya captive, and he had to deal with her alone. Not only that, but he also stepped in to rescue a hero student in immediate danger within your examination, which was the only reason he let her get away. Midoriya stared. Wow. Did he really think that highly of him? But this Mara guy just gawked at Mr. Aizawa. He wasn't blinking. That was kind of creepy. Raise your head. Do you think you could explain the situation to the police? He asked after just a little too long. They were here already. He nodded slowly. Depending on their verdict, we have a proposal to make. Mr. Aizawa hesitated. He turned back to Midoriya and narrowed his eyes. Midoriya mimicked his gaze, trying to convey telepathically the words, letting me out of your sight again, are you? He pointed at him. Stay here. Midoriya just grinned and nodded. Okay, quickly then, sighed his teacher, grasping the piece of poster paper that Midoriya had been scribbling his explanations on as he went. Mira led him back out of the room at a much slower pace than Mr. Aizawa was probably comfortable at. The door closed behind them, and Midoriya was left alone in the office. He sighed, pulling his mask from his face and letting it dangle around his neck. It could be stifling at times. However, the act of doing so caused it to fall apart in his hands. An inevitability, he supposed. Midoriya gazed out of the full-length windows and down at the group of hero students below. There was a large screen in front of them, and although it was a little too hard to make out from such a distance, he could guess that it listed the names of those who had just passed the exam he interrupted. He groaned, shoving his ruined mask in his pocket. He just had to make things difficult for himself, didn't he? There was a disgruntled tweet, and he, in that moment, finally remembered. Oh my god, Siren! In a panicked scramble, Midoriya pulled the little bird from his pocket. Stupid, stupid, stupid! How could he have possibly forgotten? Oh, poor Siren! Every time something like this happened, Siren suffered some kind of backlash. It was probably because she was a bird barely bigger than his hand, but acted like she was a miniaturized fighter jet! Siren did not look pleased when Midoriya finally had her sprawled out in his cupped palms. However, she was quick to get up and started grooming at one of her wings. The green feathers stained worryingly red. Midoriya would have to take her to the vet's as soon as this mess was sorted. Poor thing. But at the same time, he couldn't help but thank her. Things could have ended up a lot worse if Siren hadn't served as such a good distraction. He had to wait a rather long time for Mr. Aizawa and a few others beside him finally returned. He had just begun pacing around the room as he waited, staring at Siren as he did so, glancing occasionally at the ticking clock on the wall as time crept by. As soon as they returned, he ran right up to his teacher, who had his scarf back now, holding out Siren to him without a need for further explanation. Mr. Aizawa sighed. Okay, we'll take her to the vet's as soon as get back to UA. Midoriya nodded in agreement, and only because Siren had been trying to hop up there on her own several times whilst he was waiting, he allowed her to nestle in his hair. Mr. Aizawa raised an eyebrow at him as the bird hid herself from view. He just shrugged. Midoriya, please sit down, so I can too, said Mara, immediately pulling a chair out from underneath the long table that spanned the office. Actually, was it a meeting room? Not that it mattered. There were other things Midoriya should be focusing on anyways. Mr. Aizawa sat next to Midoriya, whilst Mr. Mara was opposite, beside a rather strict-looking woman in a sleek suit and tie, her face blank behind dark sunglasses that she really didn't need to be wearing inside. All of their gazes lingered on Midoriya's exposed face for a little longer than he would have liked, but he tried to ignore it. No, as you are aware, UA officially enrolled you in the hero course at the start of this new term, despite your absence. Mara paused to yawn loudly. Alongside that, you are also automatically entered into this provisional licensing exam. There was still a place for you, even though UA did inform us that you wouldn't be participating after all. There was a moment of awkward silence as he rubbed his eyes. He seemed rather tired. It took that woman clearing her throat to snap him back to reality. Sorry we took so long, Mara continued. We had to talk to various people from across different departments to get permission for this. But, long story short, because I'd really quite like to go home now, because of all your actions over the past few months, public support and general heroism, on top of the skills you unwittingly showed us today, we think it's safe to say that you are just as ready as the other hero course students, if not more than, to gain a provisional license. Midoriya could have sworn his heart stopped for a second there. Hero license? I just got off the phone with your mother, Mr. Aizawa added. She wasn't too keen on the idea, but after having a quick conversation with your father, she gave permission for you to complete your transfer to heroics and accept a provisional license, should you choose to do so. Midoriya stood up, knocking his chair to the ground and slamming his hands on the table, staring at Mr. Aizawa. Was he actually serious? But then he hesitated and frantically pointed to his uncovered injury. Midoriya, his teacher sighed. There is a good chance that you will be able to recover your quirk given time in speech therapy. Furthermore, this offer isn't just because of your powers. They're willing to give you a license to fight back for times like this, with or without a quirk. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god! Midoriya was going to pass out!
of the extra training sessions that those who fail the second half of the provisional licensing exam are obligated to take for a total of 3 months. How many depends on how well you perform,
Mara explained.
but because of the continuous villain activity you seem to find yourself involved in, we have received permission to give you a license now, to clean up any legal mess that the incident today could result in, and allow you to act lawfully in emergencies. Besides, we need a lot of new bright heroes to fill the gap All Might left behind.
No one spoke again for a moment or so whilst Midoriya just stared at the official. Eventually, the lady in the suit cleared her throat again and pulled from her pocket a small laminated card. Mira took the card from her.
Canary is your chosen hero name, correct?
Midoriya nodded frantically, hands itching to see that card. But more silence followed.
Would you like it?
Mira finally asked. Yeah! Midoriya exclaimed, which made everyone jump. Mira seemed almost scared as he handed over the card. But Midoriya's hands were trembling as he accepted it, and there was the picture on his student ID, a face lacking the marks that now marred him, and the name Izuku Midoriya beside the official hero name! Canary.
What's taking them so long? Groaned Mina loudly.
Mr. Aizawa had told them all to wait by the bus for him to return. There were a couple of security guards milling around still, keeping an eye on them, but other than that, everyone else was gone. Shinso was kind of glad of it. All those other hero schools were rather overbearing. He didn't know how Midoriya, of all people, could deal with such attention all the time.
Mr. Aizawa is with Midoriya at the moment,
Ida explained loudly for like the 5th time.
Something very serious happened, and it is important that we show our support.
I can't believe there was someone from the League of Villains here, gaped Jiro, repeating the information that they had been informed of by the officials after their results were handed out. Jiro had finished staring at her provisional license card and was now using it to gently fan herself as they waited. Shinso, however, was still pretty transfixed by his. He had a hero license. Granted, a provisional one, but who cares about those minute details? Brain Blank was now officially his hero name, and he couldn't help but smile at that fact. But yeah, his friend had just been attacked by one of the villains who kept him captive for over 2 weeks, so he probably should have been thinking about that a little more. Speaking of which, hey, there he is! Araraga exclaimed, waving at Midoriya and Mr. Aizawa, who had just appeared from inside the stadium. And he wasn't wearing his mask. Shinso could see the ragged thing sticking out of his jacket pocket. It must have lost the will to live. Shinso didn't blame it. What was weirder was that Midoriya didn't seem to care. He tried to run right over to them, but Mr. Aizawa put it in on his shoulder to pull him back and talk to him for a moment longer. But Shinso couldn't wait. Ignoring Ida's protests, Shinso pocketed his provisional license and sprinted over to his teacher and his friend. Seriously, just stay out of trouble for once in your life, was the end of the conversation Shinso caught onto. You know that's not going to get through that thick skull of his.
Shinso grinned.
Mr. Aizawa just rolled his eyes, and Midoriya mimicked Shinso's smile. Oh my god, that was terrifying. It made Shinso smile even wider. What's going on? He questioned after a moment, his gaze flickering between the two. Mr. Aizawa just sighed, shoved his hands in his pockets, and left to march over toward the bus and everyone else who were waiting expectantly, all 18 of them, staring at Midoriya. And he was still smiling without a care in the world. What? Shinso almost demanded with a nervous laugh. Is this really the time to be so happy? Didn't you almost die or something? Midoriya